Hi, and welcome to Experience Points by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. I'm your host, Dave Eng from Games-Based Learning by University XP. Find out more by going to universityxp.com. On today's episode, we'll learn from Randy O'Connor. Randy is a game designer, artist, and educator with a career spanning consoles, mobile, PC, and board games. His award winning credits include Stranger Things VR, Escape Goat 2, Walking Mars, and Spider, The Secret of Bryce Manor. As a game design consultant specializing in systems and educational games, he's collaborated with MIT Gambit, Amplify Education, Endless Studios, and more. Randy, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, I know that I invited you originally on the show because of your great past presentation that you had done at the Game Space Learning virtual conference, specifically on game design and constraints. So I wanted to jump into this very first question here on the role of constraints. So I
hmm
know that many games thrive on restrictions, whether it's limited resources, time pressure, or rules preventing certain actions. So, in your opinion, how do constraints enhance learning and game space education, and why do they make games more engaging?
That's a really good question, and I think one of the fun things there is that it's not a game without restraint. Like one of the things that I feel like you learn over the course of game design is,
Mhm,
and most definitions of game are built on the idea of a system where you're intentionally limited in some way.
mhm,
And that intentional limitation creates kind of an engaging, but importantly, an unnecessary obstacle.
mhm,
So, one of the big questions in games is it a game if you have to play it?
mhm,
So like one of my favorite examples and one of the common ones you may find out there is the concept of playing golf is a very weird thing if it's not a game.
mhm,
The restraint is you have to get this like tiny ball hundreds of yards away, and yet you're only allowed to interact through a thin metal rod.
mhm,
Like it is, in fact, the restraint that creates the learning there.
mhm,
Like you learn how to use the golf club.
mhm,
Um, and that's what the restraint does. In terms of something like educational games,
mhm,
one of the really, it's kind of play as much as a game, but there's the concept of the alternate uses test.
mhm,
So it's, like, okay, I give you a brick. What else can you do with it?
mhm,
That's a very loaded one right there, but right off the bat, the restraint is you have an object. What else is that?
mhm,
So it's like I give you another one. I give you an umbrella. It's like how do you deal with the restraint of this one physical object and what else does it mean?
mhm.
Um, yeah.
So I wanted to know more about your whole design process and philosophy, Randy, because I think this is really an interesting question. When you are looking at a game, particularly from like say it originates from an idea, a thematic consideration, maybe a mechanic or something else, when does that constraint come into your design process? Does it start your design process? Do you try to think about a theme and then integrate a constraint or thinking about a mechanic? Like, how do you think about constraints
Mm.
as a part of like a design philosophy?
That's interesting. So
Mhm,
I kind of I think there are a handful of constraints. I always start actually with kind of two sides,
mhm,
which is what is the platform I'm making the game for,
mhm,
and then what is kind of the emotion or moment or theme that I'm trying to portray.
mhm,
What is the lesson that I'm trying to get across? So if I'm making something on mobile, in fact, that creates a bunch of constraints right off the bat,
mhm,
right? So my design process is often kind of not taking for granted that, the platform.
mhm,
So if I'm making something on mobile, very few people are going to want to spend 40 minutes there.
yeah.
You have to assume that the game is going to be built around anything from like 15 seconds to like 6 or 7 minutes.
Mhm,
So right off the bat, you're saying, okay, there is a constraint.
mhm,
Um, and then from that, you start to say, okay, if it's mobile, it's also a small screen. If
Mm-hmm.
it's, like on a TV and a console, if it's on a board game, you're saying, okay, this is a physical product.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, am I going to have cards? That is a constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to have a board? If I'm going to have many of these things, a lot of my design process is um, like really respecting how much every material and moment within any of these platforms
Mm-hmm.
is can be unpacked and expanded.
I see. That's a really insightful response. Thank you, Randy. I know I think that I prefaced the question as restraints being like part of the design philosophy, but you turned it around on me and talked about how, based on the platform or the modality or the individual players, there could be constraints there as well. Per like you
Hmm.
said with the mobile platform, generally not going to be playing a mobile game for 40 minutes, but in small
Right.
bite-sized chunks, 6 or 7 minutes, that's much more appropriate and applicable. So thanks for sharing that
Yeah,
insight.
sure.
So my second question here, and again, this is going back to that great presentation you did at the last Games-Based Learning Virtual Conference. You talked about friction and how it creates a context for learning. So can you share an example of a game that effectively uses opposition or resistance to teach a concept?
Sure. Yeah, so friction is kind of anything you have to that takes time, that takes effort, that
Mm-hmm.
is, it's like literally holding down a button, for 5 seconds could
Mm-hmm.
be a form of friction.
Mm-hmm.
But often, in games, the real friction is like there's kind of two sides to it that I
Mm-hmm.
see in a lot of games is the decision, making a decision,
Mm-hmm.
of do I go left or right? Do I use this resource or that resource?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and um, and then your ability to execute that.
Mm-hmm.
So, that decision. So there's many games out there, that like the low level, space of friction is just learning a skill,
Mm-hmm.
right? Learning what's in a deck of cards.
Mm-hmm.
Like being able to remember, being able to like broadly know. And so the friction, there's a lot of just like muscle memory that you're building up in many games. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's for me, one of the most interesting things is recognizing if your game is an unnecessary obstacle,
Mm-hmm.
right? You as the designer are kind of choosing the constraints.
Mm-hmm.
You're choosing, like not just, the platform, but some of the stuff you were mentioning, like the
Mm-hmm.
actual game within it. And much of an early point of learning within a game is learning how the designer has constrained
Mm-hmm.
the experience. So an example, there's a couple games, there's too many games, and I like to think about educational games, but I also like to think about just regular games.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of those ones that stands out is Frostpunk,
Mm-hmm.
or This War of Mine.
Mm-hmm.
And these are games that are about survival. You're building cities or managing, trying to keep a family alive in a war zone.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the friction is a resource limit.
Mm-hmm.
You're often, you don't have enough, and it's going to take you energy to get more, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have, someone who's sick at home and you have to go out to, gather firewood or, you need to, your technology is like starting to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
And the friction there is, um, in a lot of ways, these are just numbers that are kind of going down or up.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when I like name them?
Mm-hmm.
What happens when I like give a name to this thing that, if you don't go increase that number, that's a child, right? One
Right.
of the things that This War of Mine or Frostpunk does is they like embrace that like these numbers and objects are like named and they're not just like Bill, they could be someone's child. They
Right.
could be someone's grandparent.
Mm-hmm.
There's other forms of friction to to turn around in like a way different way.
Mm-hmm.
But like a dribbling in basketball.
Mm-hmm.
Dribbling in basketball is a point of friction that they added just to make movement interesting. If you didn't have that dribbling, then my traversal around the court in a non-contact sport would be too easy.
Right.
So that's a friction. You have to bounce the ball as you're moving.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Uh,
I guess I have one other example that's an actual educational one,
hmm.
which is the work of Nikki Case.
Hmm.
They do a lot of things like explorable explanations and made an incredible work like Parable of the Polygons.
Hmm.
And um, these are kind of like mixes of websites and um, like interactive, like see how simulations kind of shift as you
Hmm.
move some pieces around.
Hmm.
But Nikki Case's work is like very deliberate sequences of interaction. Like I'm going to
Hmm.
give you this constrained simulation
Hmm.
and now see how, like voting works in this. Now I'm going to change voting a little bit.
Hmm.
Now see what it does. Now we're going to talk about it. And I think the friction there is, it's a website, but
Hmm.
it's followed by like that opening up of you, the user, get to interact with it. You get to
Hmm.
change those things, and suddenly you see the consequences of your changes.
I see. Great. Thanks, Randy. I think it's something that I was thinking about before when you were talking about, like friction overall, because I think you could consider, friction as part of a constraint. But I'm thinking
Hmm.
about like developing competencies within the game. And I go back to, probably one of the earliest console games I had played was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
remember I always played as Ken. And I
Hmm.
remember like it's a fighting game. You don't need to learn combos. Like you can just punch and kick your way throughout the game. But if you do learn combos, it's a lot more fun and you could potentially do a lot more different things. So I remember
Mm.
having to develop like my muscle thumb memory to do a hurricane
Mm.
kick. And I was like, super hard as a kid to try to do this on a regular basis. But playing the game a lot of practice, a lot of losing against my neighbors. I
Yeah.
learned how to do the hurricane kick with Ken as a Street Fighter character. And then
Hmm.
your point about this war of mine as like a thematic consideration, I think is also another interesting part of like a part of like of a constraint and as friction because games could just name the resources, something fungible, just like energy or emotion or, like
Hmm.
opportunity or something else. But I think that when a designer can take a game and give it a name or give it a character or something that is relatable and identifiable, I think that is a lot more. I guess you could make it friction inducing depending on what it's named as. I know that another game I also played a lot of was the Fallout series, and
Mm.
particularly like Fallout 2, and making decisions that align yourself with different factions and being like, well,
Hmm.
I don't really identify with that faction as me, as Dave, but like my character, maybe my character's not on the up and up, and my character's playing like
Hmm.
a dark side, so I can identify with that. So I think
Hmm.
naming those things and you as the designer, as the author, can make it so that something that wouldn't be considered like a constraint or friction inducing is because you've made it a thematic consideration or you've designed it in such a way where you want the player to develop that competency.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's like a really, and I think it's super interesting because I think we have like found ourselves, like, this war of mine like
Hmm.
stands out because it does uniquely like press on that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges that sometimes I also try to put to educators when I'm working with them
Hmm.
is, well, just because you named it now doesn't the flip side of this power is that it doesn't mean that object systemically represents that concept.
Hmm.
I can say, the health of a person, but as I think, we should understand that like in most games, health is not a single number,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so in fact, that is, I think, one of the key challenges we have in the educational space
Hmm.
to like both be willing to name things,
Hmm.
but also be cognizant that we haven't necessarily represented the thing, um, and to understand the limits of our representation.
Right, right. I think that like identifying those individual aspects and knowing that, like as a designer and particularly as an educator, who's creating these games that you kind of have to abstract some of those
Hmm.
resources and themes into, certain elements of the game because you'll need the game to work as a functional, like product. But, like at some point you're going to have to abstract some things that are represented in a game in a way that's not necessarily like high fidelity to what an educator would be teaching. So I think it's
Hmm.
all, up to context and interpretation, but it's definitely things to consider. So thanks, Randy.
Hmm.
Appreciate it.
Hmm.
All right. I wanted to jump into our last question here. And again, your session that you presented was, highly insightful and influential, but I want to talk about designing for not doing. So I know that many games emphasize what players can do, but your session explored the significance of what they choose not to do. So, how
Hmm.
does designing around restraint or the shifting meaning of actions impact player engagement and learning?
Hmm. So I think the thing that's fun in a game, right, is you give me an optimal path, and then you say, well, here's another thing you could do. And do you want to do that? And so generally in a game, you're going to take the optimal path.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the game is like pushing those rewards or systems or what have you to like get you to take a different path.
Hmm.
Right? Like, are you still sure? Oh, what if I give you this? What if I
Hmm.
incentivize you this way?
Hmm.
Um, and is so it often becomes like, how far do I go to get you to leave the optimal path?
Hmm.
And so one of the things I worked on some educational math games, and one of the things that's really interesting there is um, I really like unpacking what do I have to do to get an elementary school kid to want to do multiplication when it's a more difficult mental process for them.
Hmm.
Can I actually create this like interesting question about like when to do arithmetic, when to do addition
Hmm.
versus when to do multiplication? Like how many objects on screen, do I need to put before I can like incite you to consider the multiplication path?
Hmm.
Um, that's a very abstract kind of representation of this, but coming back to basketball, um, when is a the 3 point line in basketball is one of my favorite examples
Hmm.
because it works because the context of the play
Hmm.
changes whether you want to shoot 3 points.
Hmm.
And so you are like constantly questioning the value of it, like, is 3 points worth it right now?
Hmm.
Like, oh, there's no one near me and I'm good at shooting 3 points.
Hmm.
So yes, I'm going to do it. Oh, I am good at shooting 3 points, but there is someone near me. How
Hmm.
good am I under the pressure?
Right.
Right. Or like I'm bad, so I'm never going to do it. But I know
Hmm.
there's someone over there who is good at it. And so the 3 point, like the 3 point shot has a changing value. And so like that's the fun of a game is like exploring that boundary. And the
Hmm.
best games encourage that like even a subtle like change to the game itself
Hmm.
creates like suddenly, oh, the 3 point shot is a good idea. Oh, it's not a good idea. Oh, it's
Hmm.
and so that's what I really like to explore is um you know, when when is a brick, to go back to the alternate uses test,
Yeah.
when is a brick just a brick? When is it something else?
Mhm.
So,
Great. Thanks, Randy. I know that that analogy actually with a 3 point shot is very apt and I think interesting because in my mind thinking about it as from like a game theory perspective, as a player, you're like, okay, well, I could take a shot from here. If I make it, it's worth 3 points, but if I miss, it's zero. So I've given up that
hmm.
opportunity to possibly score 2 points if I could get closer to the net. But there's a
Hmm.
lot of other tactical considerations, like you said. There could be another player around me. I could be, like the shot clock could be running down. I may not be very good at shooting 3 points. There might be a teammate that is better, but they're not
Hmm.
close. I can't pass it to them. So I think all of those decisions are interesting because, like there are choices that a player can make and a player can't make. And the thing that I think connects me close to this right now is I'm playing or I guess I'm replaying it again. Are you familiar with Hades by Supergiant
Sure.
game?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So for those of you who haven't played it or heard of Hades, it's a roguelike game, which means that you get one run at playing through the game and you basically can't die. Each run is kind of unique. But what I think is interesting about Hades is that I've finished runs multiple times. So I think you could say, like, for me, quote unquote, the game is beat. But it
Hmm.
also incentivizes me to make decisions that make the game harder. And I think that's
Hmm.
really interesting because it's like, well, I mean, like the ultimate goal is to complete the game. That's why I'm playing it. But you could all add all these other components and restraints and like buffs and other things that you can do that make the game more difficult for you. But if you do complete the game with these additional difficulties, you get some sort of reward, whether they're additional resources or like unlock content or something else. So I think particularly what you said, Randy, about making it so that the game is structured, the experience is structured so that players will want to do something that they normally may not want to do, like you're talking about multiplication before, is one of those key considerations to make as a designer.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Hades is a great example. They're a company who knows how to build that structure.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Randy.
Mhm.
Right. Randy, thanks for joining us today. Where can people go out to find more about you online?
You can find me at randyo.net. I'm also on Instagram at randyo games and Facebook at randy0.
So thanks again, Randy.
Thank you.
I hope you found this episode useful. If you'd like to learn more, then a great place to start is with my free course on gamification. You can sign up for it at universityxp.com/gamification. You can also get a full transcript of this episode, including links to references in the description or show notes. Thanks for joining us. Again, I'm your host, Dave Bank from Games-Based Learning by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. So if you like this episode, please consider commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Subscribing is absolutely free and ensures that you'll get the next episode of Experience Points delivered directly to you. I'd also love it if you took some time to rate the show. We live to lift others with learning, so if you found this episode useful, consider sharing it with someone who could also benefit. Also, make sure to visit University XP online at universityxp.com. University XP is also on Twitter at university_XP and on Facebook and LinkedIn as University XP. Also, feel free to email me anytime. My email address is dave at universityxp.com. Game on.